Let's say you want better fitting clothes, so you start researching how to tailor your own clothes at home, and you hear a lot of different words and terminologies, and your face is all like, don't worry, some of those words matter, most of them don't. I don't like long intros though. Let's talk about these. Let's start with the stitch length, and this one is kinda sorta tricky in a way because you don't understand what an actual stitch is. And well, a stitch isn't the entire side seam of your garment. No, it's each individual little stitch. And to elaborate on that a little bit more, let me explain. Imagine your sewing machine needle goes down through your garment, and then it comes back up, and then it goes forward, and it comes back down again, and then it goes up, and then it goes forward. Well, that little section where it went down right here, and then it went up and then over, and then it went down right here, that little section right there is one individual stitch. And that individual stitch is measured in millimeters. So if you look at the dial on your sewing machine for that stitch length, you're gonna see some numbers. And what do those numbers correspond to? Well, they correspond to the length of that stitch. Most sewing machines gonna go from 1 anywhere up to, let's say, 5 or so, meaning 1 millimeter or 5 millimeters. See, I told you this was easy. And a standard stitch on a garment that you were gonna get from the store, well, that's 2.5 millimeters. So if you want to replicate all of that you got going on there, just shoot for 2.5. Oh, and this is where the whole wiggle room thing comes into play. So let's say you set your stitch length to 1.5, or you set it to 3.5. Is it gonna make a massive difference? No, not really at all, actually. Now, it's not gonna make a massive difference, but it is going to make a difference in and of itself. And by that, I mean, if you were to set your stitch length to, let's say, 3.5, and you were to then pull on the side of that garment, what are you gonna notice? It's kind of a weaker stitch, isn't it? Doesn't really look like it's doing too much. Well, it's kinda, sorta, not in a way, but that's totally fine. That is totally okay for things like t-shirts or even dress shirts, thinner materials. But when you start moving up into thicker materials, things like leather and denim and canvas, you want to make sure that the length of your stitch, those stitches aren't too far apart, because again, like if it's a weak stitch, you're gonna wear those tailored jeans out somewhere, and yeah, you're gonna have an accident. Let's talk about the next setting or term or word that you're gonna hear, and that's the stitch width. And 90% of the time, the stitch width, it doesn't really matter, like, at all. No, like, true story. That's because the majority of the time when you are tailoring your own clothes, you're going to be using a straight stitch. And well, a straight stitch just goes in a straight line. The needle goes in a straight line. The needle doesn't travel from side to side in any way, shape, or form. So that stitch width dial, you can set it to whatever it is that you want to. It's not going to have any sort of effect on the straight stitch at all. When the stitch width does come into play, that's when you're making another type of stitch, which is called a zigzag stitch. And what the stitch width controls is how far from side to side your needle travels. Because yes, on a sewing machine, a needle can and will go from side to side if you wanted to. You're gonna use a zigzag stitch to finish your seams, or you're also gonna use it when you're tailoring a sweater. Now, to kind of unpackage that a little bit more, it's gonna control how wide from side to side it goes, right? Well, why does that matter? Because when you are finishing the raw edge of a garment, you wanna make sure to seal it off so it doesn't just go poof in the washing machine. And if the width that you have your stitch width set to, if it's too narrow, it's not really gonna have a lot of travel from side to side, so you're not really gonna, it's not gonna do what it is that you want it to do. So you wanna go wider with your stitch width, and you'll get there. Trust me, it'll totally make sense. It comes with trial and error. But that being said, I do not want you to be that person who worked so hard to learn how to tailor your own clothes, and you get like 85% of the way there and it's time to finish that seam, and then you're like, oh man, I messed up the zigzag stitch because I didn't get the stitch width right. I totally should have listened to that guy. Next one is the backstitch, and man, oh man, this one's funny because in a way it implies that it is something, but it's more of a process than it is an actual stitch. So it kind of confuses people a little bit. And some people approach it as if like you're gonna die if you don't make this stitch. Well, no, you're not. And it's a process because it's something that you're gonna do at the very beginning and the very end of making any kind of stitch. Because when you start sewing, you're probably gonna think to yourself, okay, so, what's keeping all the thread from like not unraveling after I start sewing? Is anything keeping it from not unraveling? No, no, it's not. Or I should say nothing is. Well, that's where the backstitch, or more specifically the backstitch lever on your sewing machine is gonna come in handy, because what you're going to do is you're gonna start sewing and then you're gonna press and hold that backstitch lever. And what it's gonna do, is it's gonna reverse the direction of your sewing machine. So you're gonna kind of backtrack about a couple of millimeters, and then you're gonna start sewing forward again. Boom, easy peasy, you are good to go. What just happened? Well, you kind of backed over what it was that you just sewed, so you locked in that stitch at the very beginning, so it's not gonna unravel on you. And then what do you do at the very end? Once you get to the very end of your stitch, you do the exact same thing. Use that backstitch lever again. By the way, I got a new camera and I'm using my phone as a viewfinder, and I just now realized that I left it sitting there the whole time. Awesome. Oh well, it happens. Moving on. Basting stitch, or a based stitch. And this one, this one is a straight game changer. This one is amazing. The reason why this one is amazing and I love this stitch is because sometimes you want to know what the finished product of your garment is going to look like and what it's going to fit like without actually committing. If you have commitment issues just like I do, I totally get it. The basting stitch is for you. Because let's say you measured something and you pinned it up and you're still kind of like, I don't know if I actually got the measurements right. I don't know if I'm gonna like the fit. I don't really want to commit to this. I don't want to commit to this stitch. So what do I do? Is there an option where I can just like try it on to see how it's exactly how it's gonna fit? Yeah, you can. So what a basting stitch is gonna do is it's gonna be like the easiest, lightest, most weak stitch you could ever possibly think of. Because when it comes to strength, it's gonna come right out with a seam ripper. What you're gonna do is you're gonna set your stitch length on your machine as as far as it will go. So set your stitch length to, let's say, about 5. And then for your stitch tension, go as loose as your machine will possibly go. So that thread is just gonna barely be in there. It's not really gonna do anything aside from just kind of moderately hold the shape of that garment so that you can try it on, you can put it on, and you're like, okay, cool, I did get the measurements right. And then you just take a seam ripper, boop, that thing will just pull right out just like that, and you are good to go. Well, you're good to go to then go back and put a proper straight stitch in there, which is a little bit redundant and repetitive, but at least you know that you like the garment now, right? This term is funny and frustrating all at the same time because it doesn't really make any sense, and by that I mean the name in and of itself does not give you any indication as to what it is at all, and that's a seam allowance. Now, when I just said seam allowance, you're probably sitting there like, what is that? I don't get what that even means, like, at all. And I'm like, yeah, I know. I didn't really get it either. I'm like, why? Oh, is it important? Is it not important? I think it's important. What the heck is a seam allowance? Well, a seam allowance is just the distance between that stitch that you just put on your garment and then the edge of your garment. That's it. Because see, when you put a new straight stitch on that garment, you're gonna cut off all that extra fabric on there between the edge and then that stitch you just put on there. Well, all of that space right in there, that is your seam allowance. And this is where it gets a little bit tricky because as a general rule of thumb, you wanna shoot for 5/8 of an inch in that space in there. But just don't panic, don't worry. Like, it's literally not the end of the world at all if it's not exact, and you can kind of ballpark it in a lot of ways. Yep, I just said that. The sewing community's out there like, why is he telling me? Just don't even worry about it. The reason why you don't need to worry about it is because, well, if your seam allowance, if it's too small, if it's too narrow, you're not going to be able to adequately put a zigzag stitch right on the edge there. You're not going to have enough space between the edge of your garment and that new stitch that you just made. But, well, if it's too wide, if you left too much of a seam allowance, is it the end of the world? Well, no, but it's not really comfortable either. You got like this flap of fabric in there, like just this big hunk of fabric, and you're like, oh, serious, I don't even, Raw edge. Remember when I told you that you make a straight stitch and you cut off all that extra fabric, you know, seam allowance, blah, 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 blah. Well, that edge that you just cut, that is technically a raw edge, and a raw edge means like it's not finished at all. It's gonna just unravel on you and just go poof in the washing machine. Now, imagine a fabric weave. It's kind of like that, right? So it's like, it's either kind of loose like that or it's tight like that. I hope this makes sense, and I really hope I cut my fingernails before. Yeah, they're okay. All right, so let's say it's kind of like that, and you cut it. Well, see my top fingers right here? As time goes on, this part of the weave is going to go down, and then these are going to be exposed and just get all frayed and just, yeah. So you want to put a zigzag stitch over that raw edge to make sure that that doesn't happen. In some weaves of fabric, like let's say athletic shirts, you don't really need to finish them that much with a zigzag stitch. You can use pinking shears, or you can just cut it with a regular pair of scissors, and generally speaking, you'll probably be okay. But denim, no, 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 no. Steer clear of not finishing denim, because that will just go poof. Even if you finish it, it's still gonna, you're gonna have a bad time.